The Strangers That Came to Town by Ambrose Flack. The 1st of April was dark and stormy. Silver whips of lightning were cracking open low-hanging clouds. My brother Tom and I were recovering from chest colds. Tired of listening to the radio, we turned to the big living room window of our house on Syringa Street. "Here they come, Mother!" yelled Tom when a truck drove up in the rain and stopped at the empty cottage across the street. Mother hurried in from the kitchen, and we three looked out. That truck, we knew, contained the Duvich family and all their earthly possessions. All afternoon, Mother, Tom, and I had been watching for them with mixed emotions. For the Duviches had just come from Europe, and they were the first in the nationality to settle in our town. A stream of children accompanied by a big brown dog poured out of the back of the truck and stood in a huddle in the rain. Mr. Duvich and the biggest boy carefully helped Mrs. Duvich from the seat and walked her into the house. "I wonder if Mrs. Duvich is ill," murmured Mother. "She must be," said Tom. "I wonder if it would be all right for Andy and me to help them move in their stuff." Mother shook her head. It was a strict family rule that any illness which kept us out of school also kept us indoors. Yet the Duviches got along very well without help from us. Every child pitched in and helped carry all the boxes and bundles into the house. In no time at all, it seemed, the truck was empty, and the Duviches were settled in their new home. That was the signal for Mother to step into the kitchen. She returned carrying a basket containing a roast chicken, steaming hot, a loaf of homemade bread, and a pie. These she took to the house across the street and gave to the boy who answered her knock. The next day when Mother was fixing lunch, we heard a faint tap at the back door. I answered it, and there, holding Mother's basket, stood a pale, dark-eyed boy in a faded shirt and patched overalls. In the basket were the empty dishes, all of which shone in a tiny, very shapely potted rose tree covered with delicate, pink-tipped buds. It was a beautiful plant, the first of its kind to be seen in our neighborhood. "I send them a basket of food," Mother said slowly, deeply touched, "and get this queenly gift." She stopped to visit the Duviches a week later, but the boy who opened the door said, "Mama's sick. She stay in bed today." Mrs. Duvich never came to visit us, so Mother made no further attempts to see the family. But Father disagreed when she said she thought the Duviches wanted their Syringa Street neighbors to leave them alone. Syringa Street seemed to be a friendly street, but from the start the Duviches were marked people. They were the one poor, struggling family in the midst of a prosperous community. It didn't take people long to start talking about how different they were. At school, everyone made fun of the thick black bread sandwiches the Duvich boys ate for lunch, and the girls stared and pointed at their boiled-out rag pickers' clothes, obviously salvaged from the dump on the outskirts of town. Mr. Duvich's job in the local meat-packing plant made his walk home an odoriferous one. The Syringa Street youngsters meeting him on the street would hold their noses as he walked by. The Duvich's dog, Casimir, behaved just like the family to which he belonged. He seemed to be afraid of his own shadow, and nobody had ever heard him bark or growl. But Mother, remembering the potted rose tree, always had a friendly word and a smile for the young Duviches, and she always managed to find a bone for Casimir when he scrapped up the courage to venture across Syringa Street. One fine Saturday in July, 2 years after the Duviches had moved in, Father took Tom and me on a camping trip to Durston's Pond. The pond was only 4 miles north of town and was an excellent place for swimming and fishing. We often had the quiet little pond all to ourselves, but on our arrival that afternoon we found the Duviches in possession. Mr. Duvich and the younger boys were casting from shore. The older sons were fishing for bass from a flat-bottomed rowboat. Tom and I ignored the Duvich boys, but Father went up to Mr. Duvich and put out his hand. "Hello, Mr. Duvich. It's nice to see you and the boys here." Mr. Duvich was a lean little man with watery blue eyes and a kicked-about look. Gratitude for being agreeably noticed showed in his face, and he shook Father's hand. "I know the mosquitoes are biting," Father went on pleasantly, "but are the fish?" Proudly, oh so proudly, Mr. Duvich exhibited the catch that would probably feed his family for a week. He had a fine catch of bass, perch, and sunfish, all of them alive, swimming around in the oaken wash-tub in which they had been dropped. Father told Mr. Duvich that we couldn't hope to do as well, but we'd try. We three pitched our tent on a little hill beside the pond and rented a rowboat for the afternoon. Then Father, with a happy sigh, lay down on the blanket for a nap. Tom and I got into our bathing suits, and for a while we stayed out in the boat, fishing. Feeling hot and sweaty later on, we rowed to the shore to fetch towels and soap from the tent so we could wash. On our way back to the water, we stopped to look at the fish still swimming around in the oaken tub. The Duviches had moved on and were now fishing in a small arm of the pond just below us. They had their backs to us and were almost out of sight. Tom and I, our glances meeting over the big cake of soap in my hand, were similarly and wickedly tempted. We held a brief whispered conversation. Then, egged on by Tom and quite willing on my own, I played a shameful trick on the Duvitches. Without considering further, I dropped the cake of soap into the tub of fish. "Let's go," whispered Tom as we had watched the soap sink. We raced back to the tent, had some sandwiches, and played ball for a while. Later on, we swam out to the deep water. Tom scrambled up a floating log and dived off. I tried to climb on it too, but kept tumbling back into the water. While we were splashing around, the Duvitches returned to the spot on shore where they had left their tub of fish. Soon Tom and I heard their muffled cries of disbelief and dismay. Then we saw Father get up, walk over to them, and look down at the tub of fish near his feet. In a moment, he motioned to Tom and me to come ashore at once. Looking as guilty as we felt, we swam in and joined the group around the tub. In the midst of our stricken neighbors stood Father, holding the half-melted cake of soap in his palm. The fish had perished miserably in the soapy water, and were unfit to eat. Not only had Tom and I snatched precious food from the Duvitches' mouths, but we had also revealed the scorn we felt for them. Father's eyes were narrow slits of blue fire in his white face. I never seen him so angry. One look at Tom and me told him everything. "You will begin," Father said in a voice I didn't recognize, "by saying you're sorry." Tom and I stumbled through our apologies, trying to avoid looking at the Duvitches. "Do you realize," Father went on coldly, "that in certain primitive communities, the sort of stunt you pulled will be punishable by death?" "Turn over the tub," Father said sharply. We turned it over. The gray, soapy water ran away in bubbly streams, disappearing into the ground. And the poisoned fish lay exposed on the grass, quiet, strangled, open-mouthed. "Count the fish," Father ordered, his voice like steel. Tom and I got down on our knees. "How many are there?" demanded Father. 61, I said. "How many bass?" 12. "Get into the rowboat," Father said in the same steely tones. "You are not to come back until you have caught 61 fish to repay Mr. Duvitch. See it that among them you bring in at least a dozen bass." Father stepped up to the tent to fetch our shirts and blue jeans. Rolling them into a tight ball, he threw them angrily into the rowboat. He then turned his back on us and stalked away. Tom and I lost no time in rowing out onto the pond. We dropped anchor, threaded our steel rods, and baiting our hooks began to fish. I knew that if it took us all summer to catch them, we dared not set foot ashore without 61 fish. Almost at once, Tom pulled in a good-sized bass, and 10 minutes later, 2 yellow perch were added to our string. The crestfallen Duvitches went home. Father threw himself down on the blanket. That was about 4 in the afternoon. Oh, the mosquitoes! They were bad enough while the light held, but as evening came on, millions of them swarmed out of the swampland surrounding the pond. After an hour of it, we wanted to leap overboard. They got in our ears, our noses, even our mouths. Nestling in our hair, they bit through our scalps. Several times we slipped over the side of the boat, ducking under the water to escape the bloodthirsty swarms. The night dragged on while the whining clouds of mosquitoes grew thicker. "Andy, what time is it?" 10 o'clock, Tom." "Is that all?" Tom groaned. He pulled in another bass and then killed 6 or 8 mosquitoes with one slap. 2 hours passed and midnight was ghostly on the pond. The moon sailed high in the purple sky, casting a great white shaft of quivering radiance on the water. But sitting on a hard rowboat seat, aching with tiredness, it all seemed like a nightmare. "Andy, what time is it?" 2 o'clock, Tom." The treetops whispered in the breeze. Owls hooted mockingly, we thought, and bats circled over our heads. Our only comfort was the campfire Father kept burning near the tent. The bright flame flared like a beacon light in the dark. We went on fishing as our tormentors bit and sang. Each hour took forever to pass, and I fairly panted for the light of dawn to come. "Andy, it's 4 o'clock, Tom, and we've got 16 fish." Dawn finally came, but a long stretch on Durston's Pond in the blistering July heat still faced us. The rising sun cast glistening circles of rose-colored light on the windless surface of the pond. The mosquitoes thinned. The fish continued to bite, but as we fished, the sun mounted steadily, and by 11 o'clock it had become a ball of fire in the cloudless sky. Tom and I began to bake in the heat waves that shimmered over the pond. "I wish it was night again, Andy," groaned Tom as after sweating out an hour of it. "This is worse than the mosquitoes." I tore a piece of cloth from my shirt and made it into a cap. "Take this and cover your head, Tom," I said, handing it to him. "We might get sunstrokes and faint." "I don't care if I do," Tom said feebly. "I'd rather be unconscious." No breeze stirred. No cloud shadowed the pond. Even the bird life of the swamp, usually bursting with melody, was silent and motionless. Tom was drooping visibly in the glare, and I tried hard not to look at his scorched face. Between 3 and 4 o'clock, we dropped lines in a school of yellow perch and pulled up no fewer than 20. The bass continued to bite in the deep black holes of the swamp, which bristled with tree trunks. Aching, blistered, moving like machines, Tom and I geared ourselves for the home stretch. When the sun, dropping low, had lost its fury, and the sky began to pale, I pulled up the 13th bass. That bass was our 61st fish. Drooping from lack of food and sleep, Tom and I rowed to shore where Father was waiting. "Count them," he said. Obviously, we would receive permission to land only when we had produced the required number. 61, said Tom, including 13 bass. Very good, said Father in businesslike tones. We will now restore to Mr. Duvitch his rightful property. I stumbled out of the boat, aching all over, but somehow something inside of me was rejoicing. I guess that Father was secretly proud of Tom and me, and I realized, too, that all through the night he had suffered with us. We drove in silence to Duvitch Cottage. There we found Mr. Duvitch sitting alone on the front porch. When he saw Tom and me, and we silently handed him the strings of fish, he gulped and swallowed hard. Then in a voice raw with emotion, he protested that he did not wish us to suffer so. "Will you shake hands with the boys?" asked Father. Instead, Mr. Duvitch broke down. Tom and I did not know where to look. During these moments, we suffered more intensely than we had suffered in the clouds of mosquitoes and under the blazing sun. After our neighbor had composed himself, he seized our hands and bowed his head over them. Tom and I swallowed hard. Then we went to Mother, who had heard about our ordeal on the pond from one of the neighbors. When she saw Tom and me, she burst into tears. She tried to embrace us, but we drew back painfully. Soon, she had us plastered with a thick coating of soothing sunburn cream. In bed, our skins stuck to the sheets and pillowcases, but we slept as if we had been drugged. We woke up around noon the next day. "It's high time," I heard Father say calmly to Mother, "for this senseless feeling against the Duvitches to stop, and I'm willing to do my part. Tonight we're having supper with them. Mr. Duvitch said that since Andy and Tom caught the fish, he'd feel better if we all shared them. After a few hints from me, he invited us over. It may be a trial, but we ought to be able to bear it." We walked across the street at 6 o'clock, not knowing what to expect. The Duvitches, dressed in their Sunday best, bright and shining as we had never seen them, received us as if we were royalty. They looked at Tom and me, and then delicately looked away. I shuddered when I thought of what we would have had to endure had this been any other family. The young Duvitches, thrilled by their first party and by the family's first acceptance in this country, kept showing their pleasure in wide, delighted smiles. I couldn't believe that they were the same timid, downcast youngsters I had known at school. We ate fried fish at a long plank table in the backyard. Father kept the conversation going. As he told stories and jokes, we discovered that the Duvitches had a gift for gaiety, and how they loved to laugh. After supper, David played folk songs on his accordion. Mr. Duvitch turned out to be something of a ventriloquist. He made the dog, Kazimar, talk in Polish, and the cat, Jan, talk in German. I could tell that the Duvitch family was a great surprise to Father, and that he had enjoyed the evening tremendously. "To think," he murmured as we crossed the street, "that they should turn out to be the people of courtesy and accomplishment." Father sighed and shook his head. "They're being looked down on and ignored by their inferiors." After that evening, things began to improve for the Duvitches. Our neighbors looked up to Father, and often followed his lead since he was the only college graduate on Syringa Street. They decided that if the Duvitches were good enough for a highly educated man like Father, they were good enough for them. So they started inviting Mr. and Mrs. Duvitch to community parties. It wasn't long before the Duvitch boys and girls started making friends in the community. David was invited to play his accordion at a country dance, and he ended up being one of the town's most popular musicians. The other Duvitch youngsters taught their folk dances to the boys and girls at school. Even Kazimar began to take on the ways of an American dog, daring to bark and growl on occasion. Syringa Street presently had reason to be grateful to Mrs. Duvitch, who turned out to have a great gift for nursing. In times of severe illness, the doctor invariably suggested that she be sent for. When Mrs. Duvitch slipped into a sick room, she never failed to bring along an air of peace. After an hour or two, the patient was calmed and the family reassured. Soon people began to turn to the Duvitches with all kinds of problems. The elder Duvitches, with their old-world wisdom, would sit by the hour and talk gently and convincingly against fear, false pride, disgrace, and grief. One winter day, Mr. Duvitch gave Father a pair of handsome fur-lined mittens. just the right size for Father's enormous hands. After our neighbor had left, Father drew on the mittens, which had a slightly ashy odor. Probably one of the boys found them in an ash heap at the dump, Father remarked. But why should I value them any less? Who would have dreamed the Duvitches would have so much more to offer us than we have to offer them?